Welcome, everyone. I figured I would just start off by giving a little brief introduction of myself, Virgil, also, of course. So, I am Anja Aronowsky Cronberg. I am the founder and editor-in-chief of Vestoj, which is a research platform with one of its main outputs being an annual journal. And I'm also a senior research fellow at LCF. Virgil, of course, is the men's creative director at Vuitton, and also men's artistic director. Man, I always get this.
Same here. I didn't even know at what point they changed that. Like when I was in school, it was
I
pretty.
know it's one of the questions for you for later. But okay, so wait, let me get this straight. You are the artistic director for men's at Louis Vuitton and the creative director of Off-White, which you started in 2013, right?
Yeah,
So you're logging on from your home studio outside Chicago.
exactly.
I'm in Paris in my living room. And I thought just to give like a kind of background a little bit to the students who perhaps haven't met us before, because you and we first met maybe 4 or 5 years ago. I remember at the time I was working on one of the issues of Vestoj that dealt with authenticity, and I interviewed you. We had this long conversation in a hotel lobby in New York.
Yeah.
And I remember emerging like a little dazed, completely famished, like into the late afternoon sunshine, like after this interview that had gone on much longer than I'd anticipated. And we've sort of stayed or carried the conversation on since in different shapes or forms, often via WhatsApp chat, which is like your preferred method of communication, I think, Virgil, and then also in conversations, on the phone, in person when we've been able to. And then that has more recently led to another interview that we did for an upcoming issue of Vestoj, which dealt with, deals with doubt as a theme. And that conversation then led to the idea of collaborating on a book, which is what we're doing at the moment. So the book is a sort of part philosophy of life, part philosophy of work, part theory of where fashion is at, where fashion could or should be. And it touches on a range of different topics that we both think are important at the moment, from race to improvisation to irony to the importance of originality, right? Which is what we're going to talk more about today. Because I've often thought that like originality occupies this really peculiar space in fashion at the moment, because it's like on the one hand we have this idea that or maybe this myth, I don't know, like that we're still living or working in a fashion industry that has, the lone genius designer at the helm of a fashion house who works with inspirations that come from I don't know, Marcel Proust or a philosopher, or very highbrow references, right? Whereas in reality, fashion probably more often looks like a much more fluid, collaborative effort where inspirations come probably just as often from like Instagram as they would from I don't know, some
Yeah.
reference or whatever. So I think it's funny how we're kind of somehow stuck in this I don't know, in between these two kind of diametrically opposed almost visions of what originality or innovation or whatever is in fashion at the moment. And I thought for this conversation, it's particularly, I mean, originality is something that we've often talked about. I mean, it's something that I think for you, it's what it's like your take on it, which on the one hand, you've been celebrated for. On the other hand, you've also been criticized for it. And in any case, it seems to go like to the, I don't know, core of what your work provokes, is about, questions, whatever. So, and hence, you know, that's what we're talking about. So I just, when I was thinking about the title for the talk, I picked The Death of the Designer as a sort of provocative title. And I was thinking about and remembering a text that that I was reading as an art student, which was a Roland Barthes, French philosopher, essay called The Death of the Author from the late 60s, 67. And in that particular work, Barthes, he posits that to really understand a work, you have to like separate the work from, or the text in his case, the text from the author, that the that like the essential meaning in a work isn't to be found actually with the author or anything that has to do with his or her life, but really it's comes from the impression of the reader. So that means that the work doesn't really belong to the author, it belongs to the public. So I was curious to hear if you think that you could draw some sort of similar analogy to fashion. Like, can you say that the meaning of fashion could ever be found, you know, with the consumer rather than with the designer or the maker?
Like, it's so funny. That intro was like a cliff, you know, like there's like so many points to jump off. I can't even choose which one to start with. So I started just writing notes. And that's what's cool about this lecture is we know each other so well that, you know, there's basically 639 people listening into like one of our usual like hour-long ping pong sessions. But I just wrote down a few notes as you were talking, and I loved only doing these talks in like an education. You know, this is not for me or you to sort of hear thoughts or whatever, even though people might be like listening to me. To me, it's under the guise of education. You know, like, what are we teaching students about the real world that they're about to enter into? So of course, just as you said in that last sentiment, is like like author and work, like put all that for aside, put all the semantics, put all the sort of intellectualism and whatever, you know, like, and let's just look at everything from a bird's eye view. And I can't, and like I've learned my lesson, you know, like I won't make any political statements or whatever, but like, how can you not? Yeah. Like, I wrote down the word fairy tale, because when you were describing like designer sitting with a quill pen outside a Parisian window, struck by Proust or struck by whatever, like, that's a fairy tale. You know, it's designed just the same way Disney is, you know, or it's written just the same way with someone like, oh, like, you know, like Griselda, her hair, you know, the locks falling out of the tower of the museum or, you know, castle, and it sticks in our mind generationally long term. And this is the asterisk when I said I wasn't going to get political, but like the Queen, you know, and the last week, you know, Harry and Meghan, just zoom out. Like, my point in saying like these buzz terms from just now to like our foundation of institution, you know, let's zoom past the year 2020 when we can understand, like, wait, things aren't polished as they sort of seemed in 2019. So when you zoom out, we're humans on Earth, like existing. And I know that's a little bit too far before we get into like the semantics of fashion or the idea of author, the idea of originality, the idea of whatever we're sort of trading terms on today. It's the only scale at which to actually understand the minutia of how humans put things in boxes so that we can sort of believe a fairy tale. And it's not, it is a fairy tale. It sounds great. It's easy. It categorizes something as something, so then you can go on to something else more complicated.
But why do we, okay, so we need the fairy tale to make like quick, to like, as you're saying, to quickly categorize and to like, but I don't know, like I can't, I still think that there's something else that is important about that myth of the creator. It's like, what about like, maybe it's there to give more meaning to fashion, to say like it's not just about commerce and products and like easy come, easy go. It's like, actually here we are creators as well. We are, we are artists also. We're not just, how do you say, like product peddlers or
yeah. There's like it depends. It depends which hour of the day you catch into my brain. Today, I'm still sort of rattled by the year 2020. Like, that's the benefit of the timestamp of this conversation.
Yeah.
But I'm looking at it from institution, right? I'm looking at the point of education. Yeah. I'm looking at the point of, here's the world, like it's equal, like empowerment is equally distributed. But if you give someone else the power, then all of a sudden, these things created on this part of the world are better than this part. Like that's institutionalized. That's the system. That's where the fairy tale is manufactured from. That's where it says, hey, this is original, this isn't. And it's just a pure sort of proclamation based on what? And that's why I do the zoom out. But of course, if you take that heavy weight that I just put on the table and you put it off to the side and say, we're going to ignore that for 2 seconds, then of course there's like this beauty and magic of fashion, of art, of science, of humans that are on Earth that are trying to create beauty given the fact set of things. When I think of like Bernini or Caravaggio or Einstein or Steve Jobs or like like Jay-Z or something like that, like it's showing that despite the norm, there's like an ambition to betterment human society. And there's like a thread there's a thread of like bettering life for the people that are surrounding them and the people on the whole globe. Then of course you have that, but then you like, okay, take the weight that I just ignored for 2 seconds. Like the 2 seconds are up, we put it back. Yeah. Then you have on Earth people that are innovating, that are for the betterment. And then you have an institution that says, oh, wait, it's to our benefit to adopt that. And that fits in the narrative, oh, that's an original, this person's original, that idea, this is the canon. And, like my favorite word, the canon. Mm-hmm. Once you have the sort of like the organic of just humanity trying to make better, and that's painting, Picasso or whatever, or the African sculptors who made, Cubism before it was contextualized as art or quote unquote, or what have you. All these, like once you start getting into the terms and which one fits in which box, then the real world looks different. But I think it's just that understanding. There is a magic of fashion. There's a magic of invention. In quotes, this idea that man invented, the inventor, like the world would be different if this human being didn't exist. That's a heavy concept, you know, and I think it jades, in my mind, it empowers the institutionalized logic of being like, I am man, top of food chain, top of the chain of human beings, and I'm actually better than other human beings because I invented the skinny jean all the way down to, you know, a cure for cancer or something like that.
So it's like originality then becomes a form of it's like a power dynamic in a way, like who is allowed to say this is original and this is not original.
Yeah, and you plug into it. You either plug into an institutionalized way of thinking, but the artifact is like, hey, I want that on my Wikipedia page. I want it on my headstone. You know, like I want the bronze statue to read. You know, because that's how humans, we're getting a little bit deep, but that's like, what is the ultimate achievement of a life, right? Is to be notable for X, Y, Z. And I like that sort of, you know, this is like, we don't have to stay this deep. You know, this gets into just like our dialogue, but I think it's important to think about trajectory. When I was a student, no one told me about the constructs of the world that I was entering into. I just wanted to be a designer because I loved the idea of Karl Lagerfeld. You know, I loved the
right? The myth.
What's that?
The idea of Karl Lagerfeld is the myth of Karl Lagerfeld, isn't it? Like that old school designer that we were talking about before, you know, the one who draws on Proust and, you know.
Yeah, you know, you got the Parisian apartment with the windows open and you draw and the people come and bring you a piece of paper and you sketch. Like, that's what I was like, I want to do that. I love the myth, but I didn't know. I was naive before I entered fashion because I thought that what glitters is gold, and it does. I'm not here to say that it doesn't, but there's a reality laden into that. You know, it's like, hey, I'm a black male. That comes with a whole set of identity weight, you know, and contextualization. Plus, you enter in the gaze of authenticity, or the gaze of, you know, is he a designer? Or no, he's not a designer. That's almost enough to recontextualize the public to be like, you know, as you know, as Ralph Simmons greatly said, like, you know, Demna, Gosha, they're designers. Don't put Virgil in that category. Like, that's very profound. You know, I think that's like a great case study for I don't know. You have to ask, you know, the institution about that. But I think it's to me, it's like a great moment to sit and pause and look at the lens of what we've discussed through just that, as a matter of fact.
That, yeah, because that like it brings me to I want to know more about what you think underpins the criticism that you've sometimes had about not being a quote unquote real designer, because I mean, it's something I remember we have talked about a few times. I remember it's like come up from time to time. What do you make of that now? Like, what
again? Like, it's going to be this is going to, like, it's a learning moment for students. Yeah. Like, these questions aren't even about me. And you know what's funny? It's not even my thought. They're sort of like, I exist as just one narrative in all the narratives of designers, right? And I almost like, I think it's more profound to just stare at the question than respond to it. Because it's like, hey, I exist as a minority voice that, you know, has a glaring difference in terms of like the whole scope of designer. I design to my own canon, right? And I'm ushering in my own canon. They call it streetwear. I reject the terminology because it's like, why can't I be a designer? Why does it have to have like a subname to then, and that subname has like a huge connotation and a huge weight to it. But I think it's more profound to sort of answer the question with just like, let's look at it and understand it from each own's point of view. Yeah. Because if I basically to your question, I spend multiples of 10,000 hours in a design studio making things, you know, there's a point where that's a fact, like it's a literal fact, like these collections, you know, I'm up to maybe like 30 runway shows and, you know, millions of Nike shoes or what have you. And, you know, 10,000 hours as a teenager DJing or whatever makes up all the long sort of content that is my work, right? There's books, there's articles, there's hours of interviews, and yet a narrative could just come out and be like, wait, you know, like he's actually like not, like those hours don't exist, that work doesn't exist. You know, I make the work and I intellectualize the work and I rigorously sort of prototype and put the rationale out there because I found that is my greatest sort of solace. Like it's understanding that you can't erase what's sort of out there, and it's up for people. It's like if you go back in ancient times or, you know, before that, it's like, it's what do people know about the practice, about the artist, about the writer, you know? So it's always myth versus reality. And
yeah, so I mean, it makes me think that, I mean, it goes in a way towards, like, I think like a phrase that you like and I like also is question everything. And when I hear you talking now, it's like it makes me think about when we look at, I mean, that's what we're talking about really, isn't it? It's like when we're looking at the structure, the system of fashion, the industry, what you call, you know, the European canon. I mean, which is the European canon,
which is the canon, yeah.
Blah blah blah, all that story that we know. It's like, yeah, who wrote that story? Who is, you know, what if I criticize somebody else? If I, as a designer or as a you know, I don't know, someone in the fashion establishment, criticize someone else for not being real or original or authentic or whatever term I might use, what do I have to gain from that criticism? Like, what does the critic gain from throwing that out there? I think that's sometimes we don't remember that. It's like we look at the criticism, but we don't necessarily think who is saying this criticism, like what's at stake here. Like,
yeah, but also, you know, what I love, and, you know, through the scale of time, and I'll keep saying 2020 because that's our generation's sort of like civil rights moment where we can actually put down the pencils and sort of see what imbalances are in the world. Mm-hmm. To your point, it's like, you know, and obviously this goes without saying, it's like, no one should be removed from criticism. That's not what I'm saying near at all. What I'm saying is that understand the soapbox and what that soapbox is built on, to give that view, to sort of lob in a particular point of view. You know, like, what canon or what textbooks or what institutionalized logic are certain criticisms, you know, lobbed from. Mm-hmm. That can be the same about, you know, gender equality. You know, it can be the same about, you know, other racial sort of like contextualizations. If I say something about, if I critique or I lob a point about you, like, it doesn't come from a vacuum. It can come from a very, how the words that I choose, or how I even sort of dog whistle it to sort of say it so that it can go on mass airways without triggering a certain set of things. Like, and I'm only bringing this, we'll zoom back out and talk about more like glowing things about fashion in a second. But I think this is a good context. It's like, let's start with reality. But it's basically, that's the world that we understand design through. It's the lens. And I think it's a great learning tool for young students as they're in their studio, developing their identity, developing their brand, developing their skill set, developing their draping, their sewing, their rationale, that knowing that the world is different now post 2020 than it was before. Like, and like, this is where we're going to get to the glowing part, right? Where it's like, you know, these phones were made, you know, Steve Jobs cooks up this idea to put this empowerment of the internet in our hands. You know, for it could be good or bad, but whatever. It's new, and it's the now. The fact that we're at a generational change of the guard too, you know, like, and that's sort of the door that I walked in. It's that the guard has changed, the rules have changed, the industry has changed, fashion is different, and it's been changing, but now there's a stark enough difference in how it operates, from editors to influencers to, you know, magazines to everything. And the biggest jewel to understand is that it's always been in flux. Everything's been in flux and evolution, from art to music to fashion. And also, when we go back to that soapbox at which criticism is sort of like can be founded, it's like, in my mind, let alone the sort of institutionalized big block that we started with, you know, the institution means like, you know, this is good, this is not, you know, racism, everything's buckled into that block, but let alone just human desire for things to sit still. You know, like, that's almost like the basis. It's like, stop. Like, you want fashion to be like the good old days. Like, you want it to be when it was small and there was no crowds to get into the show, and there was like, for an elitist few to sort of look at the next seasons, you know, so just time, and there's this human desire for things to stop so that you can understand it. But naturally, that doesn't happen.
No, but exactly, it makes me think, actually, made me, when you were talking, I was remembering, you know, like when influencers started getting popular in fashion, and the front rows were changing from, you know, the writers that come from, you know, the big New York Times and what have you, the big glossy fashion magazines, the Vogues and so on that we all know, and then suddenly these editors had to sit next to you know, some influencer that just came out yesterday, and I remember how heavily, you know, what the antagonism was like between these, you know, the old and the new then. And I remember thinking, well, of course, if you're, you know, old guard, you feel threatened. And what do we do when we feel threatened? Well, you think of all the bad things, you know, of your opponents, so that you feel better yourself, right? It's like, it's a little bit what you're saying, I think. It's like when that's why I like this. That's why I think originality is such important kind of topic to debate in fashion, because it's like everything in fashion, we hinge it on originality somehow. It's like, without originality, you know, no fashion. Without change, no fashion. But at the same time, like you're saying, we want things to be the way they were yesterday, because yesterday I had the power, not you. You know what I mean? I don't want to give because, you know, if you come...
I want to philosophize on this, like, before we get into questions, because we're going to do like 30-30, and this could already be, we're already at like a 3-hour pace.
I know.
Like, we already go, so this is faster. But like, I want to I'm going to turn the table and ask you, the intellectual, this idea of hinging value on originality, right? Yeah. Like, I understand it. I believe in it. I love the fairy tale-ness of it. But are you saying that what I hear, and I'm asking you, that like, person X, they have no name, no gender, but they made a dress, right? Or they made an object, a garment, a t-shirt, and it's so crazy. It's the original. Like, there's nothing to debate about it. Like, boom, X person is an original because they made something. At what point does like nothing? So to me, that means that like nothing before it ever existed. But clearly, there's a lot of stuff that existed. In this idea, the beauty of the beauty of the fairy tale of the original and the person who did it, so that they become exalted above regular human society, and they can just be praised because they are the original article. They are designer with a capital D, artist with a capital A. I'm asking you the specific question is about at what point does like that's obviously not possible or true that thing like they invented, they get the stamp as like, oh, you invent, it's not questionable, you are in the canon for the rest of your life. But clearly, what is the original part about it? Because things existed before. Can you hypothesize on that?
Well, I mean,
like, unless whatever religious denomination, unless you invented the earth itself, there's instances of everything before you were alive.
I think actually we use the term originality as a stand-in for a lot of other stuff. Some of the things that we already mentioned, like how do you say, like convention or power, or like exclusion, or I think like I don't think it's helpful to talk about originality. I mean, you can talk about if something is good or not good, and then you can extrapolate, this, I think this is good because XYZ, or I think it's, I don't like it because such and such reasons. But I never really have understood why originality has taken on.
Yeah.
I understand it because of all the reasons we talked about, but it's very misleading, isn't it? Because it's like you can say that something is, I can say, wow, this is totally new because I don't know what the references are, So to me, it's new. It's like the way, like I remember when I was an art student, discovering certain artists for the first time. It was like mind blowing to me. It was completely new to me. Doesn't mean it was for, art history or whatever, but for me, it was new. So I think it gets super muddled. And another point, and this I actually think is important as well, is like in fashion, we're so, I think it goes again to this myth. It's like we're so wrapped up in this idea that innovation or originality can only come in fashion from the object, from the design, from the garments, the silhouette, whatever. But at the same time, fashion is like, okay, every brand is turning into a kind of content generator, right? Or it's like you
media company. I call it like media company.
Exactly. So it's like we, on the one, it's again this sort of paradox. It's like we know that fashion brands are not, the garments are, it's one output of a fashion brand today. There are lots of other things, from books to films to I don't know, all the things that are covered under the umbrella of branding. So why can't we look at like innovation in all those other tools of communication? Why are we so stuck on originality when it comes to?
I love this is the part of the conversation that's always the best for me whenever we're dialoguing. Like, it's so not my work. It's 100% you and your colleagues, right? It's because the tide is completely, when I read about fashion, if I pick up the newspaper, if I pick up the popular online places, I hear nothing of this discourse, right? I hear, it's like such a sliver, and it makes up the whole ecosystem. It makes up 100% of the whole ecosystem. Like, in terms of how fashion is contextualized for our industry, as well as the outside public, the tourist and the purist, as I always sort of know, like, it just reminds me of like the disparity in which this is the ecosystem at which fashion is discussed, written about, the headlines, the importance, the glory, the fairy tale. It's not the designer. Like, I can't design, this is what I do. I basically can't do what I do. I design, I do the shows, LV show, 100 looks, Off-White show, 40 looks plus men's and women's, and I go back and do LV show, then I do the campaign, then I do the set design, then I do the invite, then I do the website, then I art direct the photo shoot. So I'm making the stuff. Then I spend time with you or other interviews where I do only talk at this scale. Mm-hmm. But still I pick my head up, and I'm like, what is everyone talking about for fashion? And it's nothing about the sort of the grit and the reality of the emotion and the spirit. Like when I started, when I was a student, I thought that almost like every designer you could sit with for 6 hours, and then they would be like a wealth of inspiration and logic and rationale. And, more often than not, like they don't do any FaceTime with many people, like you can't find hours of them like, riffing on society of the day, it's not like, and so here I am super long-winded, like doing student lectures all the time because I enjoy it, because it's like, shit, it doesn't have to be like sort of buttoned up and whatever, but like, okay, I don't want to go, like, I'm being mindful. You finish, and then I want to hear what students are deducing from this craziness that we're speaking.
The thing is that to me, it seems like this is the work. This conversation is as much the work as the collections are the work of a designer.
Yeah. See, you and I agree, but that's not the status quo. Like, the only way that anyone would listen to this is if they take a pull quote. Like, this is the last tidbit to end on. The only way that like news travels, it's just the great metaphor for this conversation, is for someone to take one sentence out of what I've said that kind of can be edited to be polarizing, or something that's like, I can't believe he said streetwear is dead. Like, that was taken from a long train of thought that is almost like one of the bigger quotes that I've ever said, because it's spicy and the media loves that, and it's sensationalized instead of the whole logic, which is so I design all the collections, then we speak about it, but then it comes in the swell and the turbulence of media. And so what I'm saying is that I think that the space that this is the perfect to sort of summarize the whole conversation between that big block that I said, what is the institution, which basically is what's the book, what's the canon, and who wrote it.
Yes.
Right. Mm-hmm. Then it goes to fact versus fiction, fact versus reality. Like, did the person spend 10,000 hours, or like, oh wait, like I didn't do, like all that stuff came out and I didn't do any of it. We're talking like 300 SKUs,
or
12 times a year or something.
Or I was like looking on Instagram and found amazing inspiration, but for the press text, I have to write that it was, artist such and such from 1960 whatever, and
like whatever. I'm just saying, like, that's why I did the zoom out in the beginning. It's like you can look at the natural world, everyone make their own opinion, but once it's packaged in a book or a media or a headline, and then that headline has more power to shape reality than reality existing in itself. Yeah. So let's cut it there. I want to hear if what we're talking about makes any sense.
Okay, so one I think really pertinent question from one of the students, like to kind of tag on to where we've just left off, is, do you believe that fashion is a meritocratic industry? Is it really worth studying fashion?
Oh, wow. Like, I love it. That's a heavy one. I was just on with the sort of like heads of the college earlier. I won't be invited back if I say the wrong thing. But I'll tell you what, like, this gets into like where I give all the jewels, everything I've learned. Like 100%, it's the most valuable thing you can do. And the reason why is not the obvious, because it's not the reason why like my parents were like, yo, you have to go to college and get a degree, yada yada, and get a job. It's like, I always look at it in two scopes, because there's a million people plus that are like, I can do fashion without going to school. I can do what you do without sort of that pivotal moment. Like, you guys are all in the pivotal years of your career. You'll be 10 times older doing exactly this than the time period you are at school. The advantage is being in spaces where you're hearing conversations like this, along with the honing the craft. Because I do think it's ridiculous that people judge each other in the real world for the rest of their lives after what they did for just 4 years, 50% of the time. But it becomes like the foundation to question everything, as much as it becomes like this sort of bedrock to understand the practice. And then lastly, it's all metaphorical. Like, I studied engineering and I studied architecture, but I just metaphorically applied that rationale to fashion.
It is like that. There's a like favorite kind of cliche of educators that goes like that: education is there to teach you how to think. But I mean, that's a little bit what you're saying, no? That
and you never want to be in a space where you're not training your brain how to think. You know what I mean? Doing something, and I looked at school as a very practical thing. Like the industry, it was kind of like, it taught me how to multitask. Like, if I didn't have that main task, I wouldn't know how to do other things while like delivering things on time. Communicating ideas is huge. Like, remove the major, simply taking an input from a professor and outputting whatever you think, but not even whatever you think, but how to rationalize what is in your head to whatever they think they're trying to get out of you, is a metaphor for life. That's your job. That's my job with every institution that I plug into, be it Nike, Louis Vuitton, my own team, my own self. And so education at the essence for me is exactly that. It's, if you look at it through the metaphorical phase, not just like, I get this degree, all of a sudden I'm on the front pages of Vogue, like, and that's why I spent so much time talking about, because I wish when I was in school, someone would given me this exact same premise, instead of, hey, look at my runway shows, and us talking about like look number 23 of like the last show or something. Like, I just wanted to know how practical like learning how to do equates to having a career that looks like the fairy tale, to being in magazines, if that's what you want, or being at the end of runway shows, like if that's what you want, or just being in the studio. The understanding the world is the X factor,
So then, okay, there's another question on that tack, which is, what made you the designer that you are today? I mean, education sounds like it was part of it, but what else?
Not being the outcast, like when those things got lobbed, like on one hand, it can be like damaging to be like, oh, from someone that you look up to and understand, for them to just lob like a dagger that's like, oh, you're not a designer. That's a twist. Like, that's a different one that, you don't anticipate that one. And it's like, news and sensational as that was, to someone as twisted like me, that let me know I was on my exact right path. Because I was coming to the party with a different bag, you know? And I think to answer your question specifically, it was like I was obsessed about my subcultures, and that's hip hop, you know, Black culture, you know, fashion system. Basically, that comment doesn't recognize fashion design from a different canon. And I knew at that moment that I had a lot to offer. I have a lot I have almost an endless well to articulate onto the canon, which is, you know, the Parisian fashion schedule that has me on it. I have endless subculture. You know, the Instagram post that I put up this morning is like, you know, that's just a whim at 2 a.m. I was like, oh, underground hip hop from the years of 2001 to 2003 in the Midwest of America is largely undocumented. And so to answer the question, it's like skateboarding, DJing, all the stuff that I was doing outside of school, all the stuff that my parents or my teachers were like, you need to focus on school. And I'm like, no, I need to focus on DJing or traveling or graffiti or, you know, whatever. In a weird twist of weird twist and turn, that is my value as a designer. That's the grit that no one had told me, nor was ever encouraged, you know, because it's kind of the opposite. You always feel like you're distracting yourself by not focusing on what you're supposed to be doing. But having a worldview, having some sort of life experience, you know, just hanging on the corner, skateboarding with friends taught me stuff that I apply into my actual practice.
So, okay, what about, here's another question. In your opinion, what do you think is the most successful or disruptive way to network and break into the industry in terms of exposure and getting your work out there?
To me, I call it like a sort of like a zigzag, you know, like put the pencil down for like a week or a day or however long it takes and make a gross generalization about where everyone else is going.
Yep.
And then do the opposite, you know, and do it loudly and do it with purpose and do it with conviction, like loudly. And like, just from using my example, right? I was an American designer that I wanted to show in Europe. I wanted to show in Paris or whatever. You know, I had a screen printed t-shirt, one pair of jeans, and that was it, you know, and I was like, don't call me streetwear. I'm going to be a designer. Like, this is not a commercial exercise either. There's intellect and there's reasoning. Like, just like you said, like, and that's where I was more from, like, the art bag was like, the rationale behind something as simple as a t-shirt could be more complex than someone making a dress that takes 10,000 hours to sew. If that's what it's about, you know, like insert Marcel Duchamp urinal, you know.
Yeah, if everyone else is putting like well-crafted dresses on the runway, go for the t-shirt.
Say that again.
That so you're saying if everybody else is going, you know, is putting beautifully crafted couture dresses on the runway, go for the t-shirt.
Yeah, you know, it's like, but do it with conviction. You got to do it loud. You have to do it with purpose. You have to think about how it hits Instagram and how it's going to hit the webpage or how your friend is going to write a text about it. Like, it's different now than it was before, but it's very much like, it's the granular answer to that question, because I get asked it a lot. And it's very much like, you know, it's very much, you know, it's such a great example, because take back to what we said in the first half hour. It's like the 10,000 hours of the actual work. Like, the actual item has to be amazing. But you also, once it gets into the sort of media bag of it, it has to be its own set of translation to make impact. So the storyline you have to look at that side of the equation, like the institution. So let's take it to me, for example, like early in my career, I started doing dresses. I started doing women's wear as a complete reversion against this idea that I had to do men's streetwear. And what were the first reviews like? You know, like, why are you doing that? Like, I don't believe, like, imagine that they're like, that dress doesn't count. And I'm like, why? You know, like, you know, what does that mean? Like, and then so, you know, years and years and years and years of doing that, the contextualization of why the dress exists and why for me, it plays into my overall like archetype. It's still battling the perception of who I am, what I am. Like, oh, he didn't go to fashion school, yada, yada, yada. But like, and just to say, like, I'm still early in my career. You know, I haven't, you know, I'm not coming here by any means making it, but I still have that sort of like zigzag mentality from the actual item, but also the contextualization of it.
But what about the part of the question that was asking about networking? I mean, which then goes to another question about like when you hire interns or assistants or team members, like what do you look for? How do you find them?
Oh, the key is I find them, like for me, the door's always open. Like, you know, I'm easy to find relatively. Like I'm easy, like it's, as you know, as my profile is what it is, like between degrees of separation, like literal networking, like it's not hard to find someone that knows me. let alone like if you hit me on Instagram with the right tagged image, I will see it. You know, my door is open.
Right image means what? Like,
what's that?
The right tagged image means like the
like on Instagram, if you make your own image and you tag me in it, like I look at them. So if it's like a crazy cool, like if you did something next level, that's like
right.
Yeah, or if it's a creative idea, if someone was like, hey, look at what I'm working on, like, and they tag me in it, odds are, and if it's great, I'll see it. Like, or someone will share it and be like, yo, Virgil, have you seen this? Like, there's this new kid coming out of here, or whatever. You know, I have maybe like 200 employees around the world between London, Milan, in the state, you know, so I have a system. It's not just me. But I want to answer your question specifically before we go to the next of like what trait. Like everyone in my ecosystem is self-motivated. You know, like that's the trait. Like they can almost give themselves a task, give themselves a brief, develop an idea. Like no one of the 200, 300 people that I work with need me to generate the inspiration to think. Otherwise, that makes double my amount of work. You know, like it's, and so no one ever told that to me. So I always say that, like, I'm type A. Like, we're working on a project. You never have to remind me to be like, hey, are you working on that? Do you have any new idea? Like, there's always an influx of ideas coming from the bottom up. And that's the type of studio that I run and I believe in. It's like, I'm dismantling the myth that like I am like king at the top of the pyramid and everyone's a doer. You know, in my ecosystem, I practice what I preach, basically, which is like, I don't believe in the inventor. You know, I don't believe in the original. I don't parade around like everything you see that I post is like, it started and stopped with me, because it's a farce in my ecosystem. It can work for others. It can work in the fairy tale, but I don't think that that's the way forward for art with a capital A, design with a capital D, architecture with a capital A, etc.
So what about another question? Could you please talk about the way that you think, or what you think has changed in the way that luxury brands communicate with young consumers today? Like, how should fashion practitioners innovate in order to communicate efficiently with their audience? I mean, some of the stuff I think you've mentioned, like going against the grain, things like that. But are there other things that that you've thought of that are important?
It's simply this: just remove the middle layer, remove the brand and the corporate way of thinking out of the whole chain, and just look directly at culture, the consumer, the person, because here's what's happened. We're in like sort of like the middle ages of all this, right? We're at the dawn of like a new technology, which is the internet, which kind of opened the floodgates for something that was so niche to be for the mass. And now the producer needs to speak to as many people as possible to see if they want to participate. So because we're in the middle ages of that, like a formula was developed like in the sort of block, right? It's like, how do you grow? It's like you bank on past performance. Like this worked in the past, this worked last season, this worked before. This is the best performing thing of now, or this campaign was the best of that.
Yeah.
And as a younger generation who's entering this industry, if you just look at this macro scale, I keep saying the bird's eye view, the next set of systems will come, and it probably won't be based on this sort of like past performance metric and that equaling the new. Yeah. Someone's going to come and rewrite the whole thing. And that's where I think it's like, if you communicate to the industry that is like the luxury fashion consumer that is today versus the one that built these brands, they've aged, they're good 20, 30 years older than when the glory days of the handbag, of the couture dress, of the client, right now, if you compare it and contrast, like the consumer today buying luxury might be spending like 6 to 10 times more on a seasonal basis. Because look at it, in our closets, we have more shoes, more clothes, more jackets, more bags than our parents had in their whole existence. Sure. So that means they consume the advertising in a different way. They lust after the product in a different way. They feel at one with the brand, either from a historical perspective or an eye-to-eye perspective. Yeah. So many things are different that I think you have to remove the metric of success in order to just look at it in plain sight. And then you start getting new ideas.
Which actually, it makes me, made me think also that when, in a way, like in a fashion industry where the power sometimes seems to tip more towards the CEOs or the business people of the industry, and like away from the creatives, maybe we've become more used to it now, but some years ago there was so much talk about this like merry-go-round of ever-changing artistic or creative directors staying a few years and then being booted out. Like, if you as a creative, I mean, that's what I'm taking from what you're saying. Like, if you build your own audience and you have a direct line of communication with your people, you can take some power back in a way, because you're not beholden then to like, I have this position today at this high luxury fashion house in Paris, but shit, I might not, I always have to worry that I might not have that tomorrow. Well, if you have your own space, if you built your own space, that's you're tipping the scales a bit back in your favor, no?
In one nutshell, you just summarized. That's the end of the conversation. We did the impossible. You said what I had been saying. You're the writer. I can't do that. I don't write. I don't sit down. I don't contextualize words, sentence after sentence. But you took what I was saying since A to Z, since the beginning of like me talking macro, me touching on our social, political sort of history as I see it in the world. Then you also asked me, like, what did I invest in to sort of make me become me? And that's me understanding the world, the value of DJing, the value of hip hop culture, the value of Black culture, the value of education, which is an institution, as well as completing it, getting my degree in engineering and architecture, like all that, and then going through the gate of entering the fashion system, which met some resistance or criticism. He's not a designer. He doesn't design the way he does. He's not original. These buzzwords that through the media veil that you have to break through. And then you asked, like, okay, how do you exist in these rarefied spaces and seemingly do good work? And for me, you hit on it exactly. My relationship with both of my CEOs is partially the reason why I exist. Michael Burke at Louis Vuitton and Andrea Grilli with Off-White. Like, I deem as a completely rare relationship between hyper creative and intellectualized historical thinking. Like, my conversations with both my CEOs are like my conversations with you. They're not, it's a different type. I've been mentored by them and sort of, for 8 years in the case of Louis Vuitton. And so now when I'm creating collections, it's like I have this sort of freedom that is of a different era, right? It's not of the, Mr. Lagerfeld type, because that was a different time, there's a different ecosystem, a different everything. My freedom comes from me in my long trajectory all the way back to where I started, through that gate of the veil of fashion, which is like, hey, you might not belong here. Let's kick you around and let's poke you to see if you are. I create collections like the last both shows, the Off-White, and it's like it's purely talking to the 17-year-old version of myself who is the customer and who is the culture of today. There's no like, should I do this or should I do that? I didn't even pick up and like post-rationalize anything. I just realized that the collection was due and I have to put it out there. And that to me is freedom. It might not last forever. When times change, like, I'm not an idiot. Like, the factor in this equation is time. Someday my ideals will be out of frame. I'm not worried about that because that's not, I don't value myself based on the opinions of others. I value myself on that sort of like lucid thinking from A to Z and seeing it go out into the world and exist. And that's why I'm speaking to students, because I want the next generation to not be like, there's kids on this Zoom that are like, Virgil's trash. Like, he's not even a designer. Like, I showed up and he's whack. I hate him or whatever. And then there's some kids that are like, oh, okay, I get, like, I like it. I like the shoes or whatever, but I don't like whatever. I like Louis Vuitton. I don't like Off-White or what, vice versa.
Yeah.
But the message I'm delivering is like devoid of the sort of low level. It's like, you as a designer or as a writer or as an educator, don't get sort of bogged down into like, so-and-so is great, so-and-so is trash, this one, because then you've already put one foot into the slippery slope of the existing world. Like, yeah. I firmly believe that we have been given an opportunity from 2020, but from the advent of Steve Jobs throwing these like phones, like, we made our own media, we made our own Vogue, we made our own sort of Shopify account, direct to consumer. You can now decide to order sustainable fabrics that don't participate in the sort of like mountain of sort of like, detriment to the earth. Like, there's possibilities that didn't exist when I was in school going into this industry. And so if you get distracted by trying to be me or trying to exist in this sort of vacuum where you're allergic to criticism, which isn't going to happen, like, you can operate at a higher industry level and make fashion with a capital F completely fairy tale but factual.
But it kind of it also in a way nicely, from what you're saying, ties back with to where we started in terms of who owns the work, right? It's like, you're the creator, you make the work, you put the work out there, and then it doesn't belong to you anymore. Then it belongs to the audience, and the interpretation and the meaning of it is in what the audience sees, right? So yeah. in that sense, you can't ever really get, you can't judge yourself. I mean, you can't look at your own work based on, where your fortunes are at any given point in time, because of course they'll always shift. You don't have any control over that. And anyway, it doesn't matter, because
Yeah.
the work is not yours. It's like, once it's done, it's out there, and the meaning is for others. It's like what you were saying. You work. How do you say, like, your work can only really be seen, like we're talking about it now, but we don't have the bird's eye view that you've been like returning to. We're just in it, with time, when it's, properly has sat and belongs with, with the consumer, with the audience, like, then, the bigger picture maybe will emerge, no?
Yeah. It's been great. Always good. I'm surprised we landed within 1 hour.
I think we could probably talk for a few more, but to be continued.
It's got to be a series or something. But yeah,
that's why it's gonna be a book.
Yeah. Cool. It's always a pleasure.
Same, pleasure's mine. Have a good day, Virgil.
Yeah, you too. Take care. See ya.